The date, remember, was June 22nd, 1941. The explosive, thunderous force of the Blitzkrieg swept down these roads in the darkness, hours ahead of ordinary German soldiers who simply walked into the battle. The Russians were sledgehammered into a disorder and chaos of catastrophic dimensions. The catastrophe was so complete that it may, ironically, have saved Russia from collapse. All communications were lost instantly. No one knew how bad it really was. Even Stalin didn't know how bad it was. Think how many men fought on to their deaths, not knowing that the German fire war was an equal hell everywhere. This was the Russian-German War. Now the names of the tank generals were heard everywhere in the hushed tones of awe. Hübner and Hoth, von Kleist and Guderian. On the very first day, they punched a hole right through Lithuania on their way to Leningrad. In 3 weeks, they burned and bombed and smashed their way 500 miles deep on their way to Moscow. This war was over. Everyone could see it, except the embattled Russians. In the blinding visions of victory, everyone failed to see that the Germans were already lost, that they had failed in the one objective which would have given them the war. The whole of the Russian army was not surrounded, and it was not destroyed. Hundreds of thousands escaped and would live to kill Germans. The first German soldiers had already paid the ultimate price. Grief went singing back to Germany on the words of triumph. Some didn't live to see the Germans arrive. At Tartu, in Estonia, to give one example, the Russian secret police, the NKVD, emptied the prison and murdered the inmates. Day after day, the Germans continued their journey along the same high road to Moscow, which Napoleon had traveled in 1812. It was a repeat of the story, done up in modern technology. Every German soldier could sense this irony. This time, of course, Hitler would change the ending, and the ghost of Napoleon would glow with envy. Hitler moved his headquarters out of Berlin to the new bunker at Rastenburg in East Prussia. He invited Mussolini up so that he might strut and crow about this latest and greatest evidence of German superiority. He would spend much of the remainder of his life here in the bunker at Rastenburg. Swiftly, he would take control of the war away from the generals and their aides and plan it and direct it himself, sometimes in the tiniest detail. Meanwhile, the Russians, behind the face of terror, were doing everything they could to avoid falling apart and collapsing as all others before them had. The Germans captured 1 million men. The Russians recruited 1 million new men. German intelligence had told Hitler that this was not possible. Everyone in this enormous country seemed to sense and face the desperate finality of the situation. It was a struggle for life. Not the lives of individuals, for 25 million were dead, dying, or would die. No, it was a struggle for Mother Earth, Mother Russia herself. People worked themselves to exhaustion and even to death. Before the end of 1941, 1,523 industrial plants were moved east of the Ural Mountains, out of immediate reach of the Germans. All the while, the Germans kept coming, never slowing, inexorable, unrelenting. Behind their lines, the Germans too were busy. The Einsatz commandos were loose among the population like foxes in a hen roost. The Jews and the communists were rounded up and machine-gunned into pits. The executioners complained of overwork and of never being able to satisfy the quotas set for them by Berlin. Ordinary soldiers increasingly were left to take what they could from the land. The supply lines were now hundreds of miles long, and Germany did not have the means to feed both men and tanks. Men could look after themselves. Soon there were no clothes, no underwear, and men stopped taking baths, and they stank and became diseased. And this was only the beginning of the 1,000 miles into Russia and back again. On Stalin's orders, the people tried to deny the Germans everything, even a stick of wood to make a fire to boil water. Peasants put flames to their own homes and then retreated to the east, heartbroken. The great Dnieper River Dam was blown up. The pride of a 5-year plan gone in a moment. Nothing was too sacred to leave to the Germans. The fighting rose to a shrieking pitch of madness. Russian cavalry attacking a panzer division, sabers against cannon, horseflesh against armor plate. For the Germans, the battle began to acquire a routine which was psychologically devastating. Every day there was killing to be done, push forward and kill some more. Russia was infinite and unending. The landscape never changed. The killing never stopped. The great cities were bombed and bombed and bombed again. Russia, her life's blood streaming out of her in a million places, would not go down. She had the will and fortitude of a Rasputin. The road to Moscow was seeded with tank mines, tens of thousands of them. Even with the war sweeping in on them, the Russians were producing arms and ammunition at a far greater rate than the Germans. For every old tank destroyed, they produced 2, 3, 4 of the new T-34 tanks. Shells would seldom penetrate the T-34, and the German gunners raged in frustration. Snipers stalked the land, and the telescopic sight framed a new portrait of death. Along the German supply lines, the partisans began to organize, tentatively, slowly at first, then rapidly and dangerously. For every soldier assassinated, the Germans began to extract a price, the lives of 10, 20, 50 civilians. In the captured towns and cities, the enemies lurked, undefeated, deep in the shadows, poised like wounded animals ready to spring. Stalin's orders to his people had been vicious and frightening. Kill Germans. Kill them with gun or bayonet or knife. Tear at their throats with your teeth. Do not die without leaving behind a German corpse. In city after city, the Germans struck down the vestiges of communism, and some people cheered them. None of them knew that Hermann Goering predicted the death by starvation of 30 million people in these very same places. It was too bad, he lamented. But then it wasn't Germany's business to feed these people. For all her new efforts, Russia's most effective weapon was a cruel and cold-blooded one, the weight of flesh. Never did the term cannon fodder have more meaning. Men were marched out of the recruiting offices and into the German guns without training. For the Germans, it was often a fish in a barrel kind of hunt. In the first 6 months of the war, the Germans captured 3,600,000 Russian soldiers. The Russians themselves rejected these men as traitors, and Stalin threw their relatives into prison to pay for their treason. His own son was captured in the first months, and he imprisoned his daughter-in-law to make an example of her. Few of the prisoners would ever know this or have the will to care. The Germans caged them and left them to starve to death or freeze in the cold of the coming winter. Only Goering could find any humor in this. He laughingly told of ravenous Russian prisoners who killed a German guard and ate him. The broken face of European Russia became the macabre setting for this horror story. So painful, so incomprehensible, so disgusting in its every act, so hard to believe that it ever really happened. The Germans continued their advance on Moscow, determined to thrust to the very heart of this enormous country. The unending routine of travel and battle was relieved only by the crossing of the great rivers and the reduction and destruction of the towns and cities along the way. This unremitting pattern was not broken until they approached Smolensk. There, the very nature of the war itself changed. At Smolensk, the Russians knew they had to turn and fight with every resource. Moscow was still 200 miles to the east, but in the sweep of the Russian countryside, Smolensk was the last real point of defense before the capital itself became the objective. Here, the Russians used the Katyusha rockets for the first time. They frightened even the unsuspecting Russian soldiers. Here, the German army was tried and tested as it had not been before by anyone. Here, the battle raged on for 6 weeks until the Russians were again reduced to helplessness and defeat and retreat. Here, Hitler made the first of the critical errors in judgment, which would cost him and the Germans the war. Hitler stopped his force at Smolensk. He leashed it and made it sit, just as it was about to bound through the last of the Russian defenses and race the 200 miles to Moscow. For 19 days, the soldiers waited without orders from the only man who could give them orders. Hitler was like a little boy let loose in a candy shop. He didn't know where to stop and stuff his pockets next. The men polished the dust off their boots and paraded for the generals, and not a one knew that behind the veneer of defenses, the Russian army was broken, demoralized, finished. It is true, the partisans were beginning to worry the Germans a little, but there were other real problems. All of the 400,000 men in reserve had been used up. 440,000 men had been lost in the fighting, 100,000 of them killed. 50% of the tanks were out of action, 30% of the trucks. Worse, far worse. The way back to Germany was a broken, tattered stretch of several hundred miles. The problems of supplying the army were almost beyond the capabilities of the service units. It would take time to repair the lines and make them efficient. The way back was littered with the junk and refuse of war. To complicate things even more, all of the track from the border to the frontline army had to be replaced. The Russian rail gauge was wider than that of the Germans. But these were the expected problems of war. Compared to the Russians, the Germans were just a little weary, a little thin at the elbows. At last, Hitler summoned the generals, and the orders were issued. His two greatest tank generals were to take their powerful panzer armies away from the center, away from the approaches to Moscow. It was a stupid and fatal decision. Hermann Hoth was to strike north with his Third Army and try to finish off Leningrad. Heinz Guderian was to take his Second Army, do an almost complete about-turn, and drive at Kiev. Hitler was blunting both edges of his sword, and while doing so, giving his opponent time enough to recover his shield and get ready for the next blow. The battle for Kiev was really the battle for the Ukraine. For weeks, several Russian armies kept the Germans out of the city, but the panzers raced past them and penetrated 150 miles deeper into Russian territory. Khrushchev and Marshal Budyonny, the two men in charge, pleaded for a retreat. Stalin ordered them to stay where they were and die if necessary. Guderian raced his tanks southwest, cut off the Russian lines of retreat, and Kiev was lost. The Germans claimed 665,000 Russian prisoners. Even allowing for the exaggerations of the time, 4 whole Russian armies were lost. Hitler called it the greatest battle in the history of the world, and in some aspects it was. But it cost him his last good chance to take Moscow. The local quislings were summoned to oversee the German will in the Ukraine. Then, much too late, it was back to the business of Moscow. General Guderian's smile hid his growing uncertainty. It was Guderian who had given Hitler his first lessons in panzer warfare. He was the winningest general in the German army, a man of irrepressible optimism. And now he, of all people, had doubts that the invincible invaders could remain that way much longer. The desires of both sides were certainly reduced to their simplest expression. The Germans had to take Moscow. The Russians had to hold it. The Russians took advantage of the time Hitler gave them at Smolensk to fill their ranks with raw men, the weight of flesh again. Cannon fodder. Few got any training, some didn't get rifles. All went into the great maw of the German meat grinder. Thousands of women marched out to dig trenches and build tank traps in the defenses around the city. Few people of any rank or sex escaped recruitment. The battle began on the last day of September. The Luftwaffe, now close enough to hurt Moscow, gave new muscle to the German attack. The next 2 weeks were black disaster for the Russians. The Germans were flooding into the last of the Ukraine and the Crimea, conquering almost as fast as tanks could travel. Leningrad appeared ready to fall. Moscow was bombed and mortally threatened and panic-stricken. In 2 weeks, the Germans raced up to the gates of the city. Along the way, 2 more whole Russian armies were surrounded and captured. Hitler claimed 650,000 prisoners. Two things then came to save Russia: Marshal Georgy Zhukov and rain. Endless days of rain. In their stupendous efforts to win, the Germans had nearly exhausted themselves. Now the mud held them fast and prevented them from making that last grasping reach for the capital. No one yet thought of defeat. The German psyche wasn't capable of that thought yet. They would be in Moscow by Christmas and all would be well. None of these men knew much about Marshal Zhukov, and no one, not even German intelligence, knew what he was up to on the other side of Moscow. Everyone prayed for cold, for the ground to freeze so they could get moving again and get this bloody business over with. Their prayers were answered. The wish for winter was cruelly deceiving. The weaknesses of the German army, particularly those of its planners, began to show through. The temperature dropped like a stone in a well. Everything froze. Shells didn't fit the breach. Hydraulic systems didn't work. Optical sighting devices clouded up. The lubricants in the recoil mechanisms acquire the consistency of tar. Machine guns jammed after a few rounds. Automatic hand weapons would fire only single shots. Flesh stuck fast to frozen steel. Skin peeled away in strips when bare hands tried to let go. Men began to lose their fingers and toes, their hands and feet, their legs and arms, their lives to the cold. The Germans had never considered, had never planned for the contingency of fighting on through a Russian winter. The tanks, when they had fuel, when they had ammunition, attacked. Surely it was only a matter of a little time. A depressing, painful, exhausting time, yes, but the Russians were nearly bled white. You could see that from the pitifully few thousands who now stood in front of Moscow. They fought stubbornly, but surely this was the last, desperate, twisting agony of a defeated army. Then it happened. On December the 5th, with the temperature touching 36 below zero, the Russians struck back a blow so powerful, so unexpected, so stunning, that the whole psychology of the war was turned round in days. Marshal Zhukov, the man the Germans didn't know, let loose the army the Germans didn't know about. 100 divisions, 7 whole armies, including 1 million new men. 1 million men trained, equipped, dressed for the winter, fresh from fighting the Japanese in the east. They fell upon the tired, broken, demoralized Germans and exploded with the passions of hatred. Everywhere, people began to think a new and previously unthinkable thought. The Germans might not win this war. Not that they would lose, few would think that for another year. But German victory had ceased to be the unquestioned, inevitable thing that it had been. And all of the advantages seemed to fall to the Russians. The Germans, in bewilderment and despair, were thrown back. 10 miles, 20, 50, 100, 200 miles. Hitler and Hitler alone saved his army. His generals, in panic, wanted to retreat. Hitler, in fear and towering rage, ordered them to stay and fight to whatever the end might be. There would be no Napoleonic running away to death and defeat this time. Any general who could not or would not obey was brought home in disgrace. Among them, the brilliant tank commanders, Hübner and Guderian. In their tracks, the Germans left evidence of their ruthless treatment of anyone who tried to stop them. The frozen bodies of partisans twisting like puppets in the cold wind. No Russian gave a care for those Germans who puked out their Christmas dinner of frozen horse meat or froze to death while squatting in the snow to relieve themselves. By the new year, Berlin was counting the cost. 800,000 men lost, 200,000 of them killed. And Russian losses, they had passed the limits of imagination. 5 or 6 million killed, wounded, captured, missing. The Germans had entered Russia with the best equipped army in history. Now they were reduced to pathetic attempts to keep themselves warm. Crude mittens of cheap cotton. Elephantine boots woven of straw. It was the worst winter in 140 years. The great counteroffensive, which had begun so well, slowed down, then stopped forever. The Germans stayed and fought with skill and tenacity. Once again, Hitler had shown more confidence in them than they felt themselves, and he was still the unquestioned leader of these men condemned to the Eastern Front. The women of Germany donated furs to clothe the troops, and men went into battle wearing muskrat stoles and leopard skin opera coats. The spectacle inspired Russian cartoon characters and did as much as anything else to shatter the image of the invincible German soldier. The winter compounded the agony of the supply lines. Men ate frozen horse flesh because the trucks couldn't reach them. Panzers sat useless, their tanks dry, their guns cold because the trucks couldn't reach them. What is more, in their lightning sweep through this country, the Germans left behind them tens of thousands of uncaptured Russian soldiers. These men began to organize themselves into pocket armies and do real damage to the supply lines. In the intense drama of the defense of Moscow and the counteroffensive, no one had time to hear the story of the hell on earth that Leningrad was living through. The 3 million people of the city had been trapped and surrounded since the end of August. The Finns to the north, the Germans to the south. They had been bombed and shelled and attacked relentlessly, perpetually, unmercifully, day and night. And they wouldn't give up. Through the night, teenage girls labored at the Kirov works to produce ammunition for the men in the trenches around the city. These trenches, nearly 16,000 miles of them, had been dug by women, mostly. Old men and women built the 17,000 firing points and 4,000 pillboxes in the homes of the city. This place would not be taken without a flood tide of blood. A battle which would match in horror anything the world had ever seen. Hitler's hatred of the city grew with every day. He ordered that it be smashed and leveled to the ground, that no one be allowed to give up, its people to be shot or starved or driven out. The bombs and shells set the blood flowing, but they failed to break the will of these people. There was death, death everywhere. Mothers and fathers, the old men in the trenches, the young girls in the Kirov works, and the children. Most of all, the children. Marshal Zhukov saved Leningrad, saved it before he saved Moscow. He drove the people of the city, drove them in the worst hours, drove them until they felt a numb will to survive. His orders were simple and brutal. Do as I say, or I will have you shot. They responded to his orders. They learned to take the bombs and shells, and they helplessly accepted the slow, excruciating pain of starvation. There was one way into Leningrad and one way only, across Lake Ladoga to the northeast. A 100-mile ice road was built, and the convoys began to roll and the food began to trickle in. Day and night, the trucks rumbled on, and day and night, the Germans showered them with explosives. Men went on careless of their own lives. All over Russia, the same phenomenon. Individual life was not precious, just so long as there was a Russia and Russians, and always would be. It was a response incomprehensible to the Western mind. Whatever food got through, it was not enough. Never enough. People walked around in the hallucinatory days of advanced hunger. There were rations, a single slice of bread per person. But people tried to still their agony by boiling their leather coats and gloves and eating them. They ate jellied sheep guts. They stripped the paper from the walls and boiled the glue out of it, and they ate that. They tore open their medicine cabinets and ate the Vaseline and drank the hair oil. They stooped to animal things, and they cheated death day by day. And with some dignity, they lived a little longer. At last, a rail link was established on the other side of the frozen lake, and some were evacuated. The city survived nearly 900 days of this strangulation before the German hold was broken and Leningrad was relieved. In this testament to the limits of the human will to live, 1 million people died. The gun was big enough to have a name, Dora. The Germans built it to shell the Maginot Line. It was not needed there, and now it was being brought up to level Sevastopol. In the summer of 1942, the Germans had recovered from their first winter and were busy reversing the Russian advances. 2 important cities, Kerch and Kharkov, had been taken, and now it was the turn of Sevastopol. On the face of it, the city was a flaming ruin, with buildings collapsing minute by minute in the bombardment. Like Leningrad, a whole continent to the north, it was surrounded and had been for more than 200 days. But unlike the people of Leningrad, these people survived not in the ruins, but under them, under the raging inferno, in enormous caves dug in the rock. Time after time, the Germans threw themselves at the defenses, and each time the city would not fall. The shifting fortunes of war kept the diplomats as busy as generals. The United States, Britain, and Canada had promised Russia every tank, gun, and truck they could spare. The Americans, in particular, had tipped their great industrial cornucopia Russia's way. But not much had flowed from it yet. It would take time. The Russians were anxious and understandably impatient. There were more signings of more agreements. Hitler was having trouble with his ally, Finland. The Finns had never embraced the Nazis. They did not want to conquer Russia. They only wanted back the land which they felt was rightfully theirs. Finland had 500,000 good men in her army. So good, in fact, the Finns complained that the SS troops Germany had sent her were not up to standard and had no stomach for a fight. Hitler needed the Finns badly, and even in the face of this humiliating criticism, he had to play sweet. Finland had lost her enthusiasm for the war, and there was growing pressure on her to drop out. All the while, the siege of Sevastopol continued. The German guns and bombs knocked the beautiful old city apart. It was a smoking brickyard. In 6 days, they dropped 50,000 high explosive and incendiary bombs on the city. It would not go on for much longer. There was no way out. In early July, the Germans and Romanians broke through the last defenses, and it was all over. The last men were captured, trapped against the edge of the sea. While the Germans collected prisoners, 26,000 wounded men, women, and children lie in the rubble and caves. Few would live very much longer in the hands of the Germans. Sevastopol had held out for 250 days. Hitler reached for the Caucasus and beyond their snowy peaks, for the Russian oil fields as far south and east as Baku on the Caspian Sea. Before winter came again, the Germans would be another 700 miles deeper into Russian territory. In these men, you could see the changing face of the German army. It was becoming less and less German. Virtually all of the fresh troops coming into Russia were Romanian, Hungarian, Italian. Even the SS was turning France, Belgium, Holland, Scandinavia upside down in search of their special breed of man. 1/3 of the German army in Russia, 52 divisions, was now non-German. Hitler pulled troops away from the armies in front of Moscow and Leningrad to make his push here. The most spectacular German successes had been in the south, and he was obviously determined to build on success. At last, the great convoys were beginning to make their way through from the arsenals of the West. Before the war was over, the Americans, British, and Canadians would send the Russians 12,000 airplanes, 10,000 tanks, 210,000 cars, 427,000 trucks. They would march in American boots and eat tin Spam until they knew almost no other taste but tin Spam. They would never like the tanks they were sent. They could and did make more and better of their own, but the trucks were a godsend. Russia had no auto industry, and without these valuable vehicles, she could not supply swiftly moving armies in pursuit of the Germans. But the Russians would not be eternally grateful. All the Spam in the world could not pay for the lives of the millions who were dying. to stop this man, Hitler. All through that long, hot, dusty summer, the Germans went on in the same depressing, relentless, infinite routine. You could march on as far as your legs would carry you today, only to march the same distance tomorrow. To get where? Nowhere. Often they ran out of gasoline. Frequently, there was no food. The features of the men they fought began to change. Now they were true Asians. Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Bashkirs, Kyrgyz, Volga Tatars. They captured oil fields, only to gaze in despair at what the Russians had done to them. It would take months of German skill and industry before they would be of use to anyone. Behind them, in the mountains, they left thousands of these strange Asian people uncaptured. They now organized as partisans and would hurt the Germans every day they stayed here. Once again, Hitler made the same fatal error, ignored the lesson he never learned. He split his forces and halved his strength. He would not only storm the Caucasus, but would also take Stalingrad on the Volga, head on. What could Stalingrad mean to him? A year's supply of oil had already gone up the Volga. The city was an industrial fortress. The river and the rail lines to Moscow could be cut much easier if he attacked farther south. Perhaps his only reasoning was the name of the city itself, Stalingrad. The city got it first from the air. The Luftwaffe rained out every bomb the Germans could carry into Russia. On the very first day, 40,000 people died in a horrible, fiery sea of incendiary bombs. Never had the Blitzkrieg worked so terrifyingly, so efficiently. The bombs, the bombers, the Stukas, the guns, the shells, the tanks. The men with the machine guns and the flamethrowers. Stalingrad burned away to a skeletal shell of roofless walls and rubble. The survivors fled, leaving the stage set for one of the worst horror stories in the whole long history of human misbehavior. For 80 days and 80 nights, a mincer, a meat grinder, a slaughterhouse, one against one, one on one. God give me the luck to spill your guts before you spill mine. Along the rat runs, up from the sewers, down from the attics. The sound, the noise, madness, screaming madness. Every man of deadly aim stalking. Standartenführer Heinz Torvald, master German sniper. Got him, dead. Days fighting over one house. 54 German corpses in the cellar, on the stairs. In the bowels of hell, terrifying, puking fear. Days in the tractor factory, the foundry. German snipers behind the lathes, Russian machine gunners in the blast furnaces. A few more men across the frozen river to stuff the German mincer, to keep it busy. The Luftwaffe flew in more ammunition for the insatiable guns, and then flew out the wounded. There was no room for the dead. They were simply pickaxed into the frozen soil of Russia. This was the glorious 6th Army, the biggest army in Russia, the best army in Russia, the men who took Paris in 6 weeks. All 20 magnificent divisions now burned out, exhausted. But there was no sense of defeat. The Russians were fanatical. But they were driven back on the Volga and they were dying, every one of them. And then Zhukov opened his deadly bag of tricks. And out came another surprise army of 1 million men, heaving in through the Italians and the Romanians on the weak sides of the German army. In 4 days, the two arms of the trap touched, closed, and the Germans were surrounded. Racing through the snow, stumbling, falling into each other's arms, the Russians shouted and cried like children. Hitler refused surrender. He refused any attempt to break out of the trap. The Russians drew the noose tighter and tighter. The Germans froze and starved and committed suicide and died fanatically, defending useless, broken piles of brick. And then it was over. 24 generals and 91,000 men. All that remained of the 285,000 who had come to capture Stalingrad, for no good reason. Hitler had made General von Paulus a field marshal the day before, and had reminded him that no German field marshal had ever surrendered in battle. Von Paulus was the first. Once again, the whole psychology of the war was turned round. It was possible to think that Germany might lose. You could see this heresy undisguised in the despairing face of the new field marshal, Friedrich von Paulus.